My name is John Settle. I'm a graduate student. I'm majoring in urban and regional planning, and I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia. I specialize in historic preservation and cultural resource management, projects of that nature. Buchanan is a survivor. It's a pristine example of a Western Virginia river town. It's located at a historic transportation hub, the intersection of the James River, what was known as the Great Road, the route from western Pennsylvania down to Appalachia and the upland south. So the town is littered with historic resources. Buchanan is what you might call a heritage tourist site. Heritage tourism is a pretty big industry. In fact, I think of all of the tourists in the United States, I think a majority of them are actually classified economically as heritage tourists. Heritage tourists spend about $300 more than the average tourist and take about 4 more trips annually than people who do not frequent these sites. So for a town like Buchanan with so much history, yes, I think that it does help it stay alive. I found out that it's almost as if it is surrounded by a bubble that has kept it preserved for so long. We have an inventory of about 370 historic properties inside Buchanan, and about 75% of them are owned by, or they're single-family residences privately owned, which says that the people who live here have been outstanding stewards of historic integrity. I think that other towns should probably follow not necessarily Buchanan's municipal practices of preserving history, because we're currently working on that and advising them on that, but definitely following the care that their residents have given to Buchanan. Most of them are, like I said, single family residences. I think about 12% are businesses, which technically could be classified as mixed use, since these are concentrated on Main Street and are the typical Virginia commerce on the first floor, residence on the second and third floor when applicable. I mean, a majority of the ones that I'm speaking of are at least 50 years old, which makes them eligible for the National Register, that and a couple other criteria. However, I think what's really significant about the historic resources in Buchanan is that they're all what's called vernacular architecture. In other words, the people who built these houses were not architects, they were builders. They were just craftsmen by trade. They didn't go to a school anywhere and learn how to build structures in the Queen Anne or stick or East Lake style. They were educated by a mentor in an apprenticeship over a long career. And the houses that we see, for example, there's this one house that's overlooking the James River. It's a 2-story brick house. It's an interesting mixture between the Georgian, late Georgian, so late 18th century, and early 19th century Greek Revival styles. It's impossible to classify it as either of those styles, so you'd have to say late 18th, early 19th century vernacular. So just the blend of architecture in Buchanan is unique. Mary Zirkle, the town manager of Buchanan, asked us for several things. Most important was the inventory that I mentioned of about 370 properties. She also wanted a statement on the economic benefits of historic preservation, not necessarily specific to Buchanan, but something that Buchanan can more or less see and know that preserving these structures would benefit them economically. Another thing she wanted was a written description of the inventory, kind of like an analysis, as well as more or less a recommendation of what can be done for further preservation. I used the National Register criteria, which is the same criteria that the Virginia Landmarks Register uses, and Buchanan specifies in its comp plan, as well as its, I think in its zoning ordinance as well, that it follows that criteria as well. What this means is that I was looking for any property constructed in 1965 or older, or prior to then that had either an association with a significant person, significant event, significant architecture, in this case vernacular architecture, or could yield information important to history or prehistory. And that's more or less the National Register criteria. So when examining every parcel in Buchanan, which is what we did, we had to apply that criteria. And ultimately, out of, I think maybe there's 600 parcels in Buchanan, 600 or 700, I don't know the exact number, I can't remember. We had about 370 come back as eligible. And Buchanan, and I talk about this in my recommendation section, may have to reconsider what is historic in the context of their town, particularly considering the fact that 90% of the structures in the United States, of all structures in the United States, were constructed after 1945. So maybe instead of having a 50-year rule, as they commonly call it, Buchanan needs to reconsider and maybe have a cutoff year of either 1940 or 1945. That's not to say there were never any significant people in Buchanan. There most certainly were. We know that George Washington was there as a surveyor, and a few other key early American figures. However, in the consideration of every house, I don't necessarily want to say it's easier to just look at architecture, but it's certainly more feasible when making an inventory of that magnitude. There are a few houses that have had someone that's locally significant. For example, the brick house that I mentioned that's half Georgian, half Greek Revival, that home was occupied by the family of Robert Looney, who was one of the original settlers to the area. I can't really put a percentage on how much work this will be in relation to the rest of the comp plan. However, I'd say it's very important to Buchanan, particularly a place that has and will continue to advertise itself as both an antiquing and historic town. Buchanan is a remarkable town. I think they've had a wonderful start in preserving everything, both inside and outside of the existing historic district. It'd be interesting to see Buchanan continue into its 4th century of settlement while cherishing the treasures of its 3 centuries prior.